Hey legends, and welcome back to the least knowledgeable sim racing channel, where we're making up for the last few weeks of arcade and simcade content with a strong return to unabated, hardcore sim racing in the form of an online drifting simulator? CarX Drift Racing Online is a title that unashamedly owns its intention to break away from the design brief of the automobile and get it facing in the wrong direction, while simultaneously also traveling in the wrong direction, but doing so in a visual style that's only matched by the flair of late 90s metal bands. Known far and wide for my drifting prowess, the developers naturally approached me to review their game, given its recent release on the Xbox One. CarX is a modestly priced independent title with a large focus on online competition and an active community which would put some of our flagship, quote-unquote, real sim racing titles to shame. Go figure, there's something to be said about installing a 2.5GB game, plugging in a controller and being able to join a lobby within 2 minutes. Yes, my astute friend, you thought you just heard me say controller and not wheel. Rest assured, you're not about to suffer a seizure, for I did indeed say controller, as in gamepad, and not $10,000 racing simulator. You might be thinking, gee Omen, if you've basically burned that much money away in your continued investment in maintaining your virginity, why would you not hook it up and throw the oval rim around a bit, so to speak? Well, you see, the game had a bit of a difficult time recognizing my Fanatec DD1. After manually mapping all of the axes and keys and going through the process of calibrating everything as best as I could, I came to realize that the force feedback just wasn't working. You see, I was faced with no self-aligning torque forces whatsoever. To those wondering what self-aligning torque forces are, well, they're basically what make the wheel usable whatsoever. This is especially the case in drift, where you have to let the wheel go in order for the car to self-align before promptly flicking the wheel again to continue your sideways shenanigans. Without the wheel aligning itself, drifting in this game became, well, rather impossible. Luckily, I was able to plug my trusty Xbox 360 controller into the system, and the game picked it up immediately. While this is probably not the experience the developer was expecting a channel based around hardcore sim racing to share, what we'll be covering today is the casual gamer experience. The game includes a controller assist option which automatically has the virtual driver countersteering to maintain your car's angle. You might think, well, that's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it? And you would be correct. It basically makes the game an exercise in maxing the stick out in the direction of drift and modulating the throttle to maintain the angle. That said, the game still contains its challenges, and its simplistic presentation actually belies a rather deep and engaging experience. By that, I don't mean deep and engaging in the same sense as, say, BeamNG Drive, which hides a mind-blowingly revolutionary, generation-defining, stupidly ambitious physics model underneath a novel crash simulator. I mean deep and engaging in the way that you realize that you absolutely suck at making a car go sideways on tarmac in a way that's remotely predictable and controllable, even in spite of what you thought were years of rally driving training under your belt, then subsequently jumping down a rabbit hole to understand why it is that you suck so much and how to actually complete a tandem drift in the points. With that, it should be said that I know as much about drift racing as Kimi Räikkönen does about being sober.
Kimi has enjoyed tonight a lot.
With that firmly in mind and not wanting to sabotage the community's public lobbies, I can find the majority of my experience to learning the game's mechanics in single player. The game presents you with 3 main modes: drift racing, tandem drift, and time attack. Barely understanding how to make a single car drift in a way that doesn't lead to an ambulance being called to Sector 2, much less making two cars dance in a graceful sideways ballet of gaudy awfulness, I of course opted to start my journey in drift racing. The game starts you off with a trusty Hachiroku, about as vanilla to drift as apple pie and dependence on foreign oil is to America. I soon came to realize that this game has its own unique skill set, which I was in no way trained for during my stints playing Project Cars 3 over the last month on the same controller. Using what little I know of Scandinavian flicks, handbrake turns and clutch kicks, I began massacring my way through the first parking lot training stage. Before long, I feel like I had overcome the most important hurdle which faces professional drift racers. Namely, how to best disrespect my car's manufacturer by painting it a pearlescent aqua blue while bolting a collection of car wreck salvage parts onto the frame in the form of a body kit and running somewhere around 10 degrees of negative camber on the front axle. Armed with the power of hideous style, I promptly began mastering my little vehicle and grabbing a few gold trophies. CarX has the standard cash and XP-based progression mechanic. Win drifts, get cash, use cash on cars, cars become more and more outlandish and ridiculous, use outlandish cars to win bigger races, make even more money, and ideally get the XP to unlock purchases. This takes us to the car selection. Containing such community favorites as the Panther M5, Godzilla R3, Hachiroku and Fujin SX, with the body shapes lifted directly from the cars whose namesakes those conjure up, you get the feeling that this is the kind of relationship with licensing and intellectual property that only an Eastern Bloc developer could actually get away with. That said, there are a surprising number of cars offered in the game, all with a distinctly unique handling character, even evident through a simple gamepad. The tiers of car are somewhat arbitrarily separated, with real-world performance not really being the distinguishing factor, but the game rather using it more as an arcade-like progression mechanic. Track progression is handled very similarly. Each new track has a buy-in cost of both cash and XP, requiring you to grind away at your present station until you're able to unlock the next tier of progression. While this adds a sense of structure to someone playing in single player, you can't help but think that to those who bought this game to hardcore tandem drift with their friends, would probably just prefer having everything unlocked and ready to go from the start, using the competition of the drifting itself to define the challenge of the game. This leads us to the developer's subscription mechanic. Part of the reason behind putting the cars and tracks behind a virtual paywall is that this wall can be lowered by, well, real money. The game contains a subscription system, allowing subscribers certain advantages such as notable discounts on unlocking tracks, cars and mods, not to mention an array of DLC tracks. Working my way through the single-player progression system, I eventually stepped up from my Toyota Hachiroku to a Nissan Skyline R32 Godzilla R3 to a Nissan 200S Fujin SX to finally landing on the granddaddy Toyota Super Wanderer L30. Where the hell did they get that pseudonym from? With such a diverse collection of cars from all over the globe, you're probably well equipped to know I grew up in the Asia-Pacific region during the 90s. The further up the classes you go, the more equipped you become to sustain long power slides rather than momentum-initiated drifts. The higher the class of car you use, the higher the multiplier on your cash earnings at the end of an event. The unfortunate side effect of this is that you're always encouraged to use cars at the higher end of the class spectrum, even if stylistically you'd rather just stick it out with your trusty Hachiroku. While this is probably less an issue in multiplayer lobbies that are class-locked and more focused around tandem drifting, it does create a bit of a hassle during the single-player experience. My brief foray into single-player tandem driving revealed that what I had thought I'd learned by mashing the accelerator, handbrake, and erratically jabbing at the clutch to maintain my points multiplier in drift racing in no way applied to any sort of mastery or control of the vehicle in what some would consider to be actual tandem drifting competition. This was topped off with plumes of smoke from the leading car completely nullifying my ability to see what I was doing. Between this and the controller assist fighting my ability to maintain longer drift sequences without being penalized for readjustments or flying off the track, provided a perfect excuse for me to move on without having to acknowledge my lack of skill. The majority of wheelbases I saw people using online range from Logitech and capped out at the Thrustmaster level, so it's entirely possible that this game hasn't been set up or optimized whatsoever to work on higher-end direct drive wheelbases. While that's understandable given the game's target demographic, it would be nice to see this tier of hardware represented if the game ever wants to take the simulation aspect a little more seriously. Speaking of simulation, by this point you probably want to know how realistic this game actually is, so we'll touch on the physics a bit. I'll save you the anticipation and just say outright that this game is not a simulator in the way that rFactor 2 or BeamNG are. There are notable elements missing from the physics engine, and the game feels more like a bare minimum to make successful drifting happen. Whereas in a game such as BeamNG, you have to be exceptionally mindful of the car's weight transfer because of the insane drivetrain, chassis, and tire flex modeling, CarX is a lot more approximate in its physics, kind of like Dirt Rally. It provides an outline of what you think driving could be had you only ever seen driving but not actually done it yourself. There's nothing inherently wrong with this so long as your expectations are managed going into it. The game is a lot more about the competition element rather than the physical handling element. Mind you, I am conveying this experience through playing on a controller, but that is because my relatively high-end wheelbase wasn't compatible with this game, at least seemingly so, which should give you some idea about its simulation status regardless. The game simulates a variety of elements such as suspension flex, wheel geometry, tire pressures, etc. You actually get a fair degree of setup adjustment options with the car, including the standard wheel adjustments such as caster, toe, camber and tire pressures, with suspension adjustments such as spring stiffness, sway bar stiffness, etc. For a game with a relatively simplified physics model, it provides more options in this regard than I'd expected. It also provides loads of amusement when crashing. Audio-visually, the game is passable, but nothing groundbreaking. The cars resemble their real-life counterparts, but aren't going to blow your mind with polygon counts. The engine sounds, especially given how often drifting has you banging off the rev limiter, get quite grating after a while. If you're looking for a modestly priced indie game that'll scratch your itch for some casual drifting fun with friends, CarX is worth a look. If, however, you're looking to practice for your next real-life drift meet, maybe keep it to Assetto Corsa and BeamNG. But most importantly, be sure to hit the sub and ring the bell to stay up to date with future videos from this channel as we get back in touch with our more pure sim racing roots over the coming weeks. There's a bunch of free content I want to share with you regarding how to get the most out of rFactor 2, and I absolutely cannot wait to do that. So until then,